There is a difference between consciousness and localized consciousness. And localized consciousness means it has a boundary around it. How can something be made of consciousness, but not be conscious in and of itself? This is one of the pillars of the non-dual understanding, and it's such an important piece of the puzzle to even understand what is suggested with non-duality. So I'd figure we dedicate this episode solely to that single little piece, and then we discard the question of whether non-duality is the way to understand reality. No, here we just look at what is suggested. Before we even evaluate if it's likely, what do we mean when we say that something is made of consciousness but isn't conscious? Yes. So just a brief introduction. If you want a deep dive into non-duality, I have plenty of episodes on that topic. But non-duality basically suggests that everything is made of consciousness. There is only one universal consciousness, and that is the underlying fabric that creates everyone and everything in the world. So the ordinary sense of understanding reality is that it starts from matter, and then we build up a structure where when matter arranges itself in a complex system, such as our nervous system, then consciousness erupts out of that. So matter is fundamental, and consciousness is something that pops up here and there. The non-dual understanding suggests a different way of looking at it. It suggests that consciousness is the fundamental thing, and sometimes it wraps itself in different shapes and forms, so experiences arises, and the appearance of matter comes from consciousness. So it's not denying a world out there, it's not denying the experiences we have, it's just a different way of understanding what that actually is. So if everything is made of consciousness, doesn't that suggest that everything is conscious? And no, it doesn't. It actually suggests that consciousness is conscious because that's the only thing that exists. What comes into question in this statement is whether everything even exists to begin with. What is a thing? What is this everything that we suggest is conscious? And if that sounded too abstract, like let's say I look at my hand. Let's make something simple. I look at my hand and I can say that this is a hand and we all know what I'm pointing to, but it doesn't really have a start and an end. It is not detached from my wrist. So in that sense, it's not a standalone thing. And then you can even say, you could look at one of my fingers, and we all know what we mean by that, but it isn't actually a standalone thing. Here isn't one finger and a hand. No, it's the hand, I mean all of this, and the finger, I only mean this. So if I point to this, there is not one thing I am pointing to. It depends on what I mean with the whole structure. If I point to this, I could mean my finger, I could mean my hand, I could mean my arm, or I could mean all of me. Where does the thing start and the thing end? And in everyday language, of course, that becomes obvious what I usually mean. If I'm going to put a glove on my hand, you can be pretty certain that I'm not going to put a glove, like I'm not going to crawl into a glove. So it's a practical way to use thing. But when we actually evaluate what is conscious, then we need to kind of map out what we mean by a thing. And the non-dual understanding suggests that when consciousness localizes, that localization has or can be said to be conscious, or rather consciousness is conscious within that localization. There is something what it's like to be inside and to be outside. And the way we normally assume that this is, it is that if it's alive, it probably is conscious. And if it's made of something else that isn't metabolizing or isn't a life form, then it is probably not conscious. Exactly where this boundary goes, I don't know, and we don't need to go into that now. Are plants conscious? Yes, as I said, we don't go into that. But there's definitely a difference between me as a human and a rock. There is something what it's like to be me. It is probably nothing what it's like to be a rock. It is not a standalone thing. Because if it was, how do we make sense of that? It probably came from a mountain, so it was part of this big majestic mountain. And then at some point it crumbled, a big part of the mountain fell down. And then wind and rain and forces acted upon this, so it shattered into even more pieces. If the mountain had a localized consciousness that later shattered into smaller pieces, like, is this a rock or is it just part of a mountain? It is an ongoing journey for this little cluster of thing. In itself, it is not necessarily a thing that is shielded off from the rest of the world. We can talk about it as a thing because it's practical, but it doesn't really have a beginning and an end when the thingness formed. So if life is, well, consciousness is the only thing that's conscious. The thing that happens to life is it's suggested that consciousness localizes. And what that means is that there is a boundary where the universal consciousness is limited. And this boundary persists of our sense perceptions. For us humans, it's sound, not sound, you can hear, hearing, touching, tasting, smelling, and sensation. So the layers that separate the outer world from the inner world, my boundary, so to say, is my sense perceptions. If there is information coming in my inner world through sound, I say it comes from the outside. If I have a memory popping up, I say it comes from the inside. So there is consciousness here that is localized. There is a difference between the inside world of the localization and what appears on the outside. A rock, on the other hand, it has no sense perceptions. It doesn't register when it is falling down the mountain. Consciousness hasn't localized in that sense. There's no boundary around the rock from a consciousness perspective. From the inside, it doesn't feel like it is a rock. It's actually my boundary that looks at the universal consciousness and sees its fluctuations as a rock. So in that sense, consciousness, or the rock, is made of consciousness, but it is not conscious. It's made from universal consciousness. I am also made of universal consciousness, but there is a localization that has taken place. It has divided itself into an inside and an outside. And one of the ways, or one of the metaphors for this that really hammers it home, is that we experience this every night, more or less. When I dream, like let's say I dream that I'm walking in a forest. My dream avatar is looking around at the forest, and it sees a rock there. I might even pick it up. I can feel that it's cold. I can feel that it's hard and have a rugged surface. And then when I wake up, I remember this. And then my dream avatar was a localization of my consciousness. But so was the rock did not come from the outside. It also popped up in my dream. It was made of me. But the rock itself, it has no memories of the dream. It was not localized. It wasn't conscious. The stone wasn't experiencing the dream. My avatar was the one experiencing the dream. My avatar was the thing that localized inside my wider consciousness. And looking out through those boundaries, my dream boundaries, I saw the rest of my mind, or not all of it, but parts of it, and it looked like a rock. So the rock in my dream, it was made of consciousness, but it wasn't conscious of the dream. Yeah. I'd love to get a question from you right now. Is that clarifying anything for you? In case there was some kind of confusion to begin with. Once this is understood, the fact that there is a difference between consciousness and localized consciousness. And localized consciousness means it has a boundary around it. It is shielded off from the rest of consciousness. And this boundary has perception. And perception is sense perception. It registers what's outside. It picks up data from the rest of the universal consciousness. Yeah. And that's when we usually, in the sense, we say that I am conscious. The real way of saying it would probably be consciousness has localized in me so that it can be aware of the difference between outside and inside the boundary. Yeah. And if anything's unclear, please do question. Leave a question in the comment section and we'll give this another attempt. It's so valuable for me to try and make people understand this, because once it clicks, I think a lot of people would find non-duality quite rational, actually. Maybe the most logical way to understand the world. I'm not claiming it is. I'm claiming that's how I see it. Yes. Thank you for this little moment, and I hope to see you next time.